Hi, everyone. My name is Meg Nestor, and I'm with Global Sisters Report. Today, we are proud to sponsor the workshop, Migrating Towards Exploitation, Why Migrants Are Susceptible to Human Trafficking and How Sisters Are Helping. Our presenter today is Soli Salgado, a staff writer with Global Sisters Report. Soli has been reporting on this story for years, and we know you will find it helpful. On behalf of everyone at Global Sisters Report, I want to thank you for your interest in this topic that is so fundamental to human dignity. And now here's Soli.
Hello, my name is Soli Salgado, and today we will be talking about human trafficking as well as how it relates to migrants in particular. So, trafficking, it's a really tragic phenomenon, but it's also so interesting because there are different ways that it manifests around the world, and there's so many different ways to get involved in the fight against trafficking if you're interested. We'll get into all of that. But first, I want to say, as a writer for Global Sisters Report, I've covered trafficking and migration through the lens of Catholic sisters specifically. And, their ministries span every social justice realm you can imagine. And as a reporter, that really is a gift for me. So before we get into the basics of what constitutes trafficking and how it relates to migration, I think it'd be helpful to explain why sisters are such an asset to me as I write about this issue, especially because we'll also be hearing from a sister shortly who is involved in the fight against trafficking. So, migrants and survivors of trafficking trust and open up to sisters much easier than they would to others, especially to a journalist. And sisters are given a special kind of access to groups or neighborhoods that I would never be able to reach without them by my side vouching for my presence. So gangs trust sisters, some gangs, girls who are involved, girls who are being prostituted probably don't open up to anyone on earth, but they will open up to a sister. So that is just such a resource for me to have that connection, to have that confidence between the sister and the person that I'm interviewing. But sisters are also, super organized all around the world. So throughout 77 countries, Catholic sisters have their own national network to combat trafficking. In the US, for example, it's the US Catholic Sisters Against Human Trafficking. And then Talitha Kum is a network of networks. So it essentially unites all those individual anti-trafficking networks into one larger international organization. So a sister in Brazil, for example, is in touch with a sister in Malta. And because trafficking victims do go all around the world, it is so essential to have that contact on the ground really anywhere. And their mindset behind that is, traffickers are organized, they're nimble, they're connected. And so if they want to be a formidable opposition, they need to be as organized, as nimble, as connected as the traffickers. And through Talitha Kum and these national networks, they're able to achieve that. And sisters, they're also incredibly thoughtful. I mean, they are just the best people you would ever want to interview, but they're also super educated when it comes to the policies that either exacerbate trafficking or that they're trying to push for immigration reform. So for them, the ministry doesn't end at the direct service or accompaniment of the survivor, but instead it continues into legislation and advocacy. So, we'll of course get into that at the end of this conversation. If after hearing all of this, you feel compelled to do something about it, be sure to stick around for the end. We will have so many resources for you. Okay, what is human trafficking? I'm just going to borrow the definition here from the Department of Homeland Security. Human trafficking involves the use of force, fraud, or coercion to obtain some type of labor or commercial sex act. You might think that trafficking requires moving from point A to point B, but not necessarily. Okay, so the ways that it manifests. I think sex trafficking is probably the one that comes to mind for most of us when we think about trafficking, girls and women. So by the way, keep in mind when we talk about trafficking, we are talking about children as well. They do make up a percentage of that. They could be as young as 8 or 9, both in sex trafficking and labor trafficking. So when it comes to sex trafficking, girls and women are being prostituted, whether they were kidnapped to get into that position, they were coerced, or maybe they went into it willingly, but then they ended up, kind of not having any options to get out and are essentially trapped. And that is something that is a running theme among survivors of trafficking. The way they got in there, the way they got involved or ensnared might be totally different, but it's that lack of economic freedom and lack of options to leave that really unites them all. And again, there's also labor trafficking. So, let's say individuals are sometimes lured by promising jobs that they're told will have lucrative pay, will be a huge opportunity for their family, so they're willing to travel this distance for their job. So now they've got, they've added miles between them and their loved ones and are now a little more isolated and vulnerable. And in the process, they hand over their documents to their trafficker, their legal papers, only to find out that the other end of the job offer is just cheap labor and they're being exploited, but now they don't have any control because they don't have money and they don't have their documents in order to get back home. That's the main way that labor trafficking can happen, but of course, there's any number of ways that someone could end up being trafficked or exploited for cheap labor. In fact, I recently wrote a story about how seafarers have become victims of labor trafficking throughout the pandemic. So they're often migrant workers who work on commercial ships that deliver the goods that fill pretty much every store that carries any item that isn't locally made. And as these seafarers go from country to country, they can't dock at the country's port because maybe that country requires foreigners to be vaccinated and the seafarers were never given a vaccine. Or maybe that country just doesn't allow foreigners at all during the pandemic. And I say foreigners, but it might even be their home country that won't let them dock because they've been gone for too long. Even though they've been at sea for maybe 6 weeks, which is longer than the virus could even last in someone's body. And because they're unable to get off the ships at any point, they might end up stranded at sea for like 9 months at a time. And because they can't get off, their contracts just keep getting extended informally and they're not getting paid. And it's just one of those issues that has really snowballed, that they were not trafficked to begin with, but the circumstances have gotten them there. So when we talk about advocacy later, we'll discuss how sisters addressed this issue specifically. But I wanted to share this example of labor trafficking because it is exactly the kind of industry that we rely on every day, but I never at least thought about the labor practices behind it. And just one more example here, because although sex and labor trafficking are really the main ways that trafficking can come about, a sister in India was telling me about organ trafficking is another problem that they're dealing with. It's very hard to trace, but they are aware of it. So essentially it is the pursuit of eyeballs, kidneys for someone to then sell on the black market, which is absolutely horrifying. And it's not that common, but again, it is a really good example of the different creative spin-offs of trafficking, let's just say. And I also want to make clear that this issue is really easy to exotify, to imagine that this is a problem maybe if you're in India or in Cameroon, but not here where I live. And that's just really not the case. My first assignment for GSR to cover trafficking was actually about the Midwest and the ways that trafficking happens there. In fact, I'm from Wichita, Kansas, and it turns out my hometown is, just rife with human trafficking because it is, it has all those highways intersecting, and so it's just really easy to make someone disappear like that. So to say that this is happening all over the world means it's happening nearby too. And it helps to keep that in mind, especially when we talk about, being vigilant for the vulnerabilities that might, lead someone to being trafficked or groomed, as well as what you can do to help. I do think it's empowering to know that it is nearby and that it's not something that's just so far away and what can I do to help? It's a local issue too. We will be focusing on immigrants and migrants in this conversation. I do want to go over a couple other demographics who are especially susceptible to human trafficking. Runaway and homeless youths. About half of prostituted men and women in the US began as runaway or homeless youths, and their lack of a strong supportive network and being in unfamiliar environments really contribute to that particular vulnerability. Secondly, individuals with a history of violence or trauma. Traffickers are really adept at sniffing out someone with a past of domestic violence, sexual assault, or social discrimination. And the long-lasting psychological effects from that trauma, traffickers really use that to their advantage. That feeling of unworthiness or that lingering shame is what traffickers prey onto and create a dependency from there. And then, immigrants and migrants will begin. Migrant workers are actually really at the mercy of both the countries that they are leaving and the countries where they are going. So recruiters in some countries are, not subject to much regulation, and even after hooking up the migrant with their available job, will continue to charge them incredibly high rates of interest or fees to no end. And so the migrant worker becomes really indebted to that recruiter long after they should be. And then they're also tied to visas that give employers undue control of the workers' living conditions, whether or not they can leave their job if they have that permission, and they really create an environment of dependence that can be easily exploited. And, we're not even talking about the fact that language might add a sense of helplessness, distance from really any social type of network. That kind of confluence of details can really make someone especially dependent and susceptible to trafficking. And then my reporting that I've done throughout Mexico and Guatemala covers those who are migrating, so active migrants, if you will. And in one trip I did to Ixtepec, Mexico, so this is the border of Mexico and Guatemala. The Guardian Angel Sisters run the Albergue Hermanos en el Camino, translates to a shelter for brothers on the road. And the purpose of that shelter, it's not just a bed, for someone to catch a couple days while they continue north. It's really like an educational hub where sisters can both detect signs of trafficking. Their entire staff is trained in anti-trafficking, so they know what to look for in an individual to know whether they have been exploited, whether they're especially susceptible given that history we were talking about of sexual violence. And then they also educate the migrant as they continue their journey. And they say, don't take this route. It's dangerous. We've heard these stories. Take this route instead. Or keep an eye out for this individual. We've heard things, or that one. They really help orient them and organize themselves as they continue on. So it's not, yes, it's a shelter, but it's really interesting to think about these shelters are also anti-trafficking prevention hubs for that reason. And also, these are places where they can stop and apply for asylum to, at their country, that their country of destination, and they can make calls, they have access to computers. They really can regroup in a way that would leave them less vulnerable. I mean, if we think about all the vulnerabilities for that traffickers latch onto, that migrants have in spades, they don't have money, they don't have a strong network. I mean, they either left their family or they're going to their family, but it's very easy for a trafficker to think, no one's going to miss this person. No one's going to know where they are. And, their desperation, the whole point of the journey is for a better life. And so you can imagine how easy it would be to lure them for a really nice, lucrative job that in the end is just, labor trafficking, or they're kidnapped, or they become prostituted, whatever it is. These migrants are just the easiest targets for a trafficker on the road. And so the efforts like this shelter that the sisters run along the borders, whether it's the north or the south of Mexico, are instrumental to trafficking prevention among migrants. So by necessity, the introduction to this issue, it might have felt surface level and it might have felt very broad, but we just have to kind of create that silhouette before we can fill out this incredibly complex issue. So in order to dive in, I actually turned to two other people who are on the front lines of combating human trafficking and who just were delightful conversations in expanding this a little more and sharing from their perspective. So first we have Sister of Charity, Sally Duffy. She is just as involved in immigration as she is in anti-trafficking, and our conversation covered, not just what drew her to this ministry, but, individuals she met along the way who really stayed with her, legislation she's keeping an eye on, and really just all those experiences of a sister who works in human trafficking. I mean, it really is the portrait of a modern sister. So love that conversation with her. And then at the end, please stay with us because we will talk about all that concrete information and details and resources that you probably are just itching for after hearing, all about human trafficking, and you're left wondering, what can you do in the advocacy realm? We'll talk with Jennifer Reyes Lei, the Executive Director of U.S. Catholic Sisters Against Human Trafficking. Just a treasure trove of information, a lovely person. So a lot for you still. Let's get to it.
Right now, we'll be speaking with Sister Sally Duffy. Sally is a sister of Charity of Cincinnati, and in addition to having volunteered along the border over the years, she serves on the boards of U.S. Catholic Sisters Against Human Trafficking, Ohio Justice and Policy Center, and Catholic Legal Immigration Network, Inc. So thank you so much, Sally, for taking the time to speak with us to share your experiences.
Thank you, Soli. It's good to be with you again.
Good. So let's just start with how you got involved in trafficking as a ministry.
Well, candidly, I used to minister in healthcare. I did counseling and social work, and before I went into administration, and and served as a president and CEO. And I fortunately had the opportunity to work in the healing ministry of Jesus in Colorado and in New Mexico. And so it was there, somebody that I grew up in Columbus, Ohio, really encountered the immigrant population and really saw their tremendous strengths, gifts, competencies, and skills. I was just in awe of their resilience, their dedication, their real intentional commitment to community and family, and extremely faith-filled. So it was there when I was in healthcare, and clearly we had migrant workers who truly had needs. And so there was a little bit of a connection with our, particularly when I was in Pueblo, Colorado, with ministering to the migrants and ensuring that they had the healthcare services that they needed. And as I said, we're to provide the healing ministry of Jesus. It's not a question of who's eligible. Everyone is eligible, and everyone has God-given dignity and shared membership in our society. So that's where I really unexpectedly, not intentionally, realized the strengths and gifts of immigrants. And it was through that it clearly, as time went on, it became very clear with discrimination and forcing people into the shadows that there was an element of trafficking. People's wages were being withheld, or they were being threatened. A lot of them weren't paid much, and their conditions were deplorable at times, and certainly no benefits of any kind. So it really made me much more aware of how trafficking can happen when we force people to the shadows, and as we've recently seen, where we degrade people and mischaracterize immigrants, and so there, it unfortunately creates hatred and when you call people invaders or rapists or murderers, we start to degrade their God-given dignity, and it's God-given dignity and shared membership, not our dignity and not our shared membership.
And so it sounds like the people who the migrants who you were working with or ministering to in the beginning, did they perceive themselves as trafficking victims, or is it also, the kind of thing where someone doesn't necessarily consider the situation to be trafficking until they're told that that's what, the confluence of details kind of turns into? Does that make sense?
Yes. No, I think many were not aware that there was trafficking going on. Many, unfortunately, come from conditions and systems that are quite oppressive and marginalized. There's a reason that many immigrants seek to migrate, and we all have a right to migrate when we're experiencing oppressive conditions. So when you've been living in oppression, and we often see that with victims of sex trafficking, they truly have been oppressed and degraded, and their self-image. So they're not being treated with the dignity and the respect that they deserve. So, and it's sad to say when deplorable conditions are sometimes even better than what people have experienced before.
Wow. Yeah, that puts things into perspective, that for some, trafficking doesn't feel too different from their background. But so I'm curious, how has this ministry manifested for you throughout the years? How this prevention work, or like, and all the different types of ways that anti-trafficking can look for a sister, both from your experience, but also those that you know.
Well, I commend our own congregation. We have congregational stances against human trafficking, as well as a stance for comprehensive immigration reform. And so we all know that there's a broken immigration system that we are all experiencing. It's been broken for decades, and we have not taken the necessary steps to create a pathway to legalization, and above all, a pathway to citizenship for people. And we see it. I think it became loud and clear during the pandemic when you looked and saw who were a lot of our essential workers, and who continue to be our essential workers. Who were the people that were making sure that we had food on our table, or food that was getting to the grocery store? Who were the people that were working at the grocery store? Who were the people that were ensuring transportation on buses? And certainly we see it in the healthcare area in terms of and the number of dreamers who are serving in healthcare is just amazing. So essential workers, farm workers, and then we also see it with people that experience temporary protective status, that once again they've established here. And immigrants are often the entrepreneurs. They're not the cause for lower wages. In fact, studies document that they can increase the economy and increase wages for people. So it is, it's really from not just a moral standpoint, but from an economic standpoint, We need immigration reform. And unfortunately, without it, we put people in a position where they are isolated, living in the shadows. It's accepted. And, it's easy to take somebody's documents away, and especially if they can't speak the language, and don't understand our culture and don't understand the rule of law that we have here in the United States. So, there's just tremendous needs in this area, and candidly, we know how to fix it. It's not a problem that can't be solved. There are solutions that exist, and we really need to address this systemic part of both immigration and human trafficking. And there's such an integration and overlap in those two issues.
I'm glad you bring this up, because when I think about migration and trafficking, I think about my time reporting in Guatemala at migrant shelters, people who are on the move and are therefore going to encounter traffickers. But it's interesting to talk about immigrants who are settled enough, in a new place, and they're still vulnerable because of those things that you mentioned. So I'm going to jump ahead to one of my questions about laws and immigration reform that Clinic and U.S. Sisters Against Trafficking are advocating or hoping to see on the books that would help address this issue. You mentioned, living in the shadows, but are there specific legislations that you're keeping an eye on?
Yes, I mean, obviously the comprehensive immigration reform issues are top of mind awareness right now. Certainly the Modern Farm Workers Act, certainly the Dreamers, and ensuring legalization and protection for Dreamers and a pathway to citizenship, and then the Secure Act, which would relate to the temporary protective status of individuals and a pathway to citizenship. And so those are key issues right now in terms of immigration and immigration reform. A lot's going to depend on what happens with the budget reconciliation, and whether the parliamentarian might agree to certain things, or whether it could be legally tested as to whether the Vice President of the United States has the authority to supersede that kind of ruling. So, and then on the trafficking side, and please hear me, everything's a both and. We need to be providing direct service, and we need to be addressing the systemic injustices. And so on the trafficking side, for example, here in Ohio, we recently passed an expungement law that is initiated if the offense really is more related to prostitution or sex trafficking. We're currently in the process of trying to advocate to create a pathway for expungement, the removal and erasing of someone's record for crimes that are committed while they are forced or coerced. And this would apply to labor trafficking. And so that's currently being addressed here in Ohio. There are certainly issues at a national level that relate to human trafficking. We forget that the 13th Amendment of the United States still has an exception clause where if you are incarcerated, you don't have the same rights as other individuals. And of course, unfortunately, there's definitely a disproportionate number of people of color who are both incarcerated as well as that they're in detention centers as well. So we know that we need to change that exception clause in the 13th Amendment. I think the other thing to keep in mind is that there is a difference between smuggling and trafficking. And I think that's an important distinction that sometimes gets confused when we're speaking of the border and border issues. In particular, someone may be engaged by a coyote and pay for services to be able to be transported from another country to the United States. But once they're here, if that becomes any way of coercion or force, for example, threatening to tell legal authorities or threatening to do harm to their families or asking for more money, we're talking about trafficking at that point, whether it's sex or labor. And so I do think, there are bills right now that, for example, a national domestic bill of rights that would ensure certain protections for all individuals. So if you're working in a home or you're working and doing childcare or you're providing services to the elderly, you're protected the same way you and I are protected because we are citizens of the United States. So we need to ensure the civil rights and the human rights of everyone.
And this gets me thinking about how about the misconception that trafficking is related to like being on the move, and that's not necessarily how it is. It can be like, just coercion is already like within that umbrella. Do you want to talk about that a little more? The ways that there are some misconceptions when it comes to the terminology or just the most fantastical images we have of trafficking?
For me, a grace-filled moment to meet a young woman who experienced sex trafficking, Alexis Martin, who goes by Key Martin. And, at a young age, in her, 14, 15, she was being lured and into a relationship with an adult, and unfortunately taken advantage of, and then coerced and forced into providing sex, and in exchange for money that benefited the person that she thought was her boyfriend. And it is it's a tragic situation, but how to get out of that is incredibly difficult. If you stop and think, you're financially totally dependent on this person. Once again, you've been demeaned and degraded, so your self-image isn't in the best position to make healthy choices, and you've been isolated and separated from those that probably would be the healthiest in terms of being helpful to you in terms of escaping those conditions. And so it really is a tragic situation. And so, so I've really, learned from listening to Key in terms of, how that kind of seductive system works. And I've also learned and witnessed the incredible resiliency. I mean, these are survivors and who are now role models and witnesses for others in terms of that. And they also can be the most instrumental advocates. As I always say, the people that are most impacted are really the voices we need to be hearing. And so, for example, when it comes to immigration reform, dreamers are certainly incredible in terms of relaying their stories. And then certainly survivors of labor and sex trafficking are incredibly impactful, as well as insightful in what systems need to be changed.
Wow, yeah, all very true. And before I forget this, the way that migrants are particularly vulnerable, you mentioned how being isolated is one way that traffickers kind of begin either grooming or preying on their victims. Can you talk about other, I suppose, steps that they take before they get there? I mean, sometimes it might be as swift as a kidnap, but sometimes it's more of a process. Can you tell us a little bit about how that might look based on the victims that you've spoken with or trends that you know from your time in the ministry?
Yeah, once again, first off, there's an economic need. And so if you don't have financial resources, you're forced into dependency. And dependency creates a control mechanism. And, in terms of, and sometimes that control mechanism, unfortunately, it can be the injection of drugs too. And so, there's control in terms of financial, there's control in terms of relationships, there's control in terms of whether you can even leave a room or leave a house or leave a farm or leave a trailer. So there's all kinds of control mechanisms that are put in place. And then there are the threats, not only to you that you'll have to go to prison or be deported, or the threats to your family. And the threats to the family are incredibly significant and controlling. And so it really, the whole system is just, it's deplorable, it's degrading, it goes against everything God and calls us to do in terms of bringing about the reign of God. People ought to be free. They ought to be, they have a right to healthcare. They have a right to education. They have a right to work. They have a right to migrate. They have a right to asylum. And unfortunately, we take away people's rights, or we've been narrowing their rights as we've done in asylum.
Yeah. Are there any individuals, you mentioned Key earlier, is there anyone else that comes to mind when you think about someone who kind of illustrates the problem, or who's just stayed with you and inspires you to keep on in this work?
Like here in Ohio, Jose Cabrera, he's a dreamer. He works for the Nation Solidarity Network. He inspires me because of his passion, his risk taking. His mother inspires me. She lives here in this area, and because she took the risk of leaving her country and escaping poverty and harmful situations to ensure a better life for her children. And isn't that what any of us would do? I mean, isn't it what we want? We want what's best for our children. And they are contributing, they're productive, they're caring, they're loving, they're justice seeking, they're community minded. So, rather than threatening people or rejecting them, we ought to be embracing and thanking people, and not assimilating, but integrating. And as the receiving community, we ought to be the ones saying, how can I help? How can I be supportive? What can be helpful? And so I think it's, if we believe in the body of Christ, we're asked to become the word, not just speak the word. Thank you.
So grateful Sister Sally was able to take the time to speak with us and really add that personal touch to this conversation that I was hoping for. Maybe now you know what I mean when I say sisters are incredibly thoughtful and passionate and educated on these subjects, and that just makes for a great interview. So glad she was able to showcase that for us all. And now, as promised, we'll turn to the advocacy portion of this conversation. If all this, chit chat and information was making you curious as to how you can get involved in the fight against trafficking, we'll turn to Jennifer and she will guide us through that.
Here with me today is Jennifer Reyes Lei. She is the first executive director for U.S. Catholic Sisters Against Human Trafficking. And before that, she was a lay missionary with the Incarnate Sisters of Charity in Peru, and she ran their international justice, peace, integrity of creation office. And that is where she spearheaded their corporate stance against trafficking. So we'll hear more about that later. But welcome, Jennifer. Thank you so much for sharing your insights with us.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
So after sharing the heartbreaking realities of human trafficking and the dangers it poses to migrants, I want to leave our viewers with a sense of empowerment, some concrete actions or practices that they can absorb alongside the hard truths that I had discussed earlier. And by now, they're aware of the power of networks like U.S. Catholic Sisters Against Human Trafficking and why sisters in this ministry are so organized and connected around the world as they face this challenge. But I'd love for you to tell us specifically about the ways in which sisters engage in prevention when they're not on the front line. So not all sisters have trafficking as their full-time ministry, but they still like to be involved and be engaged in the organization. So why don't you tell us ways that they do that kind of from the sidelines?
Absolutely. And even I can expand that beyond our members, our lay people as well, not just sisters. And the majority of our members, including the Catholic sisters who are active and participate, don't actually have human trafficking as their full-time ministry. They are engaged in other ministries, but they volunteer with the organization. That's one great way that you can be doing something else sort of full-time, and then a couple times a month, join a meeting, join a campaign, get involved with the organization and support in the ways that they can. Sisters also, as you mentioned, are so connected. So even if anti-trafficking isn't their full-time ministry, when they show up in other spaces where they are ministering, maybe it's schools, maybe it's within their local diocese, maybe it's a healthcare system, they're bringing the information that they've learned about human trafficking into those spaces and helping to educate others to be aware, to help prevent human trafficking. Even though, they wouldn't say anti-trafficking is their full-time ministry, they always take what they're learning into those other spaces, into the people that they're engaging with, so that they can also be more aware and help to be safer.
So outside of like a migrant shelter, which I talked about earlier, what are other ministries in which this can be incorporated?
Yeah, honestly, this is an issue that intersects like everywhere in society. So if you're working in a school, children are incredibly vulnerable to human trafficking, and it's so important for educators, for school staff to know and recognize the signs of human trafficking. If you work in any kind of healthcare setting, again, like most survivors of human trafficking have said at some point during their trafficked experience, they engaged with a healthcare worker. And so if we can educate them about those signs and the right questions to ask to try and, identify if somebody might be a victim of a trafficking situation, that's so important. And then even in our local churches, everyone sort of thinks, it's not something that's happening here, it's something that's happening out there, but so often it's hidden within our own communities. And so again, just continuing to put up, signs, to host little 101 type presentations, asking, especially in churches, having the priest preach about human trafficking as one of their homilies, or making an announcement after church about opportunities to learn more or to get involved. All of these spaces of our day-to-day lives intersect with human trafficking. And so really everywhere, it's needed, whether it's like a store, if you own a business, you can put up signs in your business, when you go to restaurants, when you travel, hotels and airports are huge hubs that trafficking victims pass through. And I've been really pleased to see so many more, airports and hotels and other places like that are putting up those signs with the National Human Trafficking Hotline number, ways to call and report suspicious activity, things like that.
Yeah, I think one reason why trafficking, out of all the issues in the world, makes us feel so impotent is because it's so hidden that we don't know where to start. I mean, it thrives in the shadows. And so that secrecy also leads us to believe that it's this exotic phenomenon and it's just too impossible for us to know how to chip away at it. I feel like it makes me feel so small when I think of how large and, hidden how it all is. So what are some suggestions you have for those who want to help survivors of trafficking but don't know how? So these are people who have escaped the trafficking situation, maybe they're in shelters or in the care of someone, but how can we directly help them?
Absolutely. The first thing I would say is do a little bit of research about what type of program or shelter might already exist in your local city. We know that there are not enough, housing and shelters available for the need that there is for survivors, but there are more and more that are opening and starting, every day. So there's a good chance that there might already be some kind of program or shelter existing in your city. Find out what that is and then ask what they need. Most often you won't be able to engage directly with survivors out of, safety and care and concern for them, but you could probably do a collection drive and donate clothing, donate personal hygiene items. You might be able to actually be a tutor. A lot of survivors haven't been able to complete, maybe a high school education, certainly not anything more advanced than that. And so as they work to get either their GED or maybe try and get into like a local community college, a lot of times they need tutors, they need support with that education. And also just funding, survivor houses need so much funding in order to just keep running and providing the great services that they're doing. So you could do a fundraiser for them. And I know that's something that they would really appreciate.
So how do they know who is a survivor that would need help? Is there some sort of like privacy that would prevent them from just like finding this person, or is it more like just the organization and then they kind of set them up with like a tutor, for example?
Yeah, absolutely. Usually because of, privacy issues, you're not going to be able to just like find somebody, especially if they're a recent survivor. There are certainly lots of survivors who have, many years separated from their trafficking experience and are professionals, are out there in the world, engaged in this work that you'd be able to recognize and identify. But those who've, recently been able to escape their trafficking situation, you're not going to be able to find out like who they are or probably connect with them personally. So it's getting connected to those organizations. Catholic Sisters across the country run a number of houses and shelters that we're connected to, and there are so many more just beyond our network as well. So getting in touch with those organizations and programs is the best way to go about that.
Hmm. And then what can they do to end trafficking as a practice? Like, I know you guys are big on petitions, and I was curious if there are specific laws that you are, looking to get in place or that could use some support. What are some of the more structural things that people can do?
Yeah, definitely looking at like the legislation side of it is so important. Advocacy is one of our three main priority areas because we know that the laws that are in place impact this crime being able to continue. And so certainly, paying attention to laws. One that was just recently reintroduced that we're going to be creating some campaign materials around is the Trafficking Victims Protection Act Reauthorization. This is a bill that was first implemented a little over 20 years ago and gets reauthorized every few years, but is so critically important for both the prevention end and the funding end of supporting survivors on their road to recovery. And so sort of stay tuned, we'll be putting out some more information about that, but that's one like immediate piece of legislation. Campaign that we did earlier in the year too was looking at the plight of seafarers. With the pandemic, it's really exacerbated the exploitation of seafarers around the world. And so we were encouraging people to get Walmart, one of our largest, producers who relies on all of these goods that are being shipped across the world, to sign on to what's called the Neptune Declaration. And this is an international agreement that works to prioritize seafarer safety, to make sure that they have access to the COVID vaccines, to make sure that their contracts aren't being, unfairly extended without pay, that there isn't violence. So that was, sort of one call to action we've done recently. And, in general, too, one of the main things we do on what can we do to kind of end trafficking as a practice is to look at those root causes. So some of the root causes we really focus on and identify is gender inequality, racism, economic inequality, and environmental disasters and destruction, as well as migration and looking at sort of migration laws. So all of these are such big issues in and of themselves, but we know that they intersect with human trafficking. And so when we're looking at legislation, we're not just looking at legislation that specifically talks about human trafficking, but we're looking at what's going to help to alleviate some of those root causes. How can we empower vulnerable communities who are targeted by traffickers because they don't have economic opportunity, to support themselves and their families? How can we stabilize, those communities and make sure that they do have access to secure housing and to good work, so that they don't fall into the hands of traffickers?
And can you talk a little more about like when you the corporate stance against trafficking, your previous work before this network? Tell me a little bit about that, what that looks like, and yeah, I'm just curious.
Yeah, so a process that a lot of women's religious congregations have is taking a corporate stance, which is sort of this public stance and agreement throughout the congregation that this is a priority issue for our congregation, and also kind of sets actions that they're going to take to follow up with that. So when I worked for the Sisters of Charity of the Incarnate Word, we I helped them as the congregation go through this process of taking a corporate stance against human trafficking. And so on the back end, a lot of what that looks like is, education of the sisters to understand the issue, understand how it intersects with their charism, understand what the reality is in the world, and then how, their particular ministries might intersect with that. So two of the largest ministries of that particular congregation, like many women's religious congregations, are education and healthcare. And we've already talked about these are two huge institutions that intersect with human trafficking. And so in taking the corporate stance and having the congregation vote to approve this as, kind of a priority issue for the congregation, then that meant, we could begin to expand beyond just the congregation to a lot of their sponsored ministries. So to their schools, to the healthcare systems in which they work, to do this type of education, to bring in, students and encourage students to do projects on human trafficking, to host, different kinds of educational opportunities for healthcare workers and staff. And then, just for the sisters in the congregation at large too, to see how human trafficking intersects with some of the other social justice issues they were already involved in, and then get plugged into the network like U.S. Catholic Sisters Against Human Trafficking to work together with others.
Gotcha. And I'm also thinking back to how you mentioned, that intersection with other ministries, and how, in conversations, sisters with me even say like, oh, if I go on a plane, I'll talk to the stewardesses or the flight attendants, whatever, and tell them about like things to pick up on, or they'll talk to the hotel staff and what to look out for in terms of like age disparities or how someone's acting. Can you tell our viewers some of those tips in case they, feel so compelled as to kind of spread awareness wherever they can? What are the types of things they should look out for and things they can communicate to others to look out for that are signs of trafficking?
Definitely. Yeah. I mean, a few of the ones that you mentioned are big ones. Noticing the, kind of relationship dynamics between people. So if there's a much younger, girl with an older man, she's not allowed to speak for herself. You can kind of notice some of those dynamics. They maybe don't seem to be related necessarily. Those are just red flags. It doesn't necessarily mean it's a situation of trafficking, but there's some of the red flags to look for. Somebody not knowing where they are. If you encounter someone kind of in the street or out in public and they seem very confused or disoriented about, they don't know what city they're in, or aren't sure necessarily how they got there, that's a huge red flag, that they didn't voluntarily choose to be in this location. Oftentimes too, if they don't have any like identifying documents on them, or aren't allowed to keep their own documents. On the labor trafficking side, some of the things to look out for are like, if somebody's living where they work, that can often be a red flag of, it could be a potential, sign of human trafficking. Again, not being able to speak for themselves, there's like a boss or a manager who comes in and, speaks for everyone, but doesn't want the employees kind of speaking or engaging with anyone else. Those can be some big signs. And then, one of the biggest things we tell sort of like parents or adults who have children in your life is just noticing sudden changes in behavior. Can be a big red flag. Again, it might not be trafficking, but it could be some other type of like exploitation or bullying that could lead to a situation of trafficking. So, noticing those sort of sudden changes in behavior, if the child becomes more withdrawn, if they, don't do the things they used to do, they're only hanging out with one or two people now, or sort of suddenly shifted friend groups pretty quickly. Or if they start to get lots of gifts, that's another big sign that they're being groomed by somebody into a situation of trafficking. If they're in a new relationship and all of a sudden they're getting these really like fancy clothes or jewelry or purses, really expensive items, that's a big warning flag.
Gotcha. And then, if our viewers want to like incorporate some sort of training into their businesses or their industries, how can they go about that?
Yeah, there are lots of great trainings out there. I mean, our organization, we're happy to come in and, customize a training or just do a basic human trafficking 101 type overview for any group or organization. If you work, in the hospitality industry, we mentioned, hotels and airplanes and things like that. ECPAT is really, kind of the premier organization that does trainings with the hospitality industry and gets them to sign on to what they call the code to really incorporate these anti-trafficking practices in their industry. And there might also be local groups. I'm located in St. Louis, Missouri. We have a statewide coalition of anti-trafficking advocates, and I know they do trainings all over the state, with people. So you can also just kind of look in your local area and see what type of human trafficking coalition already exists in your community, and invite them in to give a presentation as well.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for your time and expertise, Jennifer. It really helps to be able to like put our arms around this issue and feel like it's something that we can actually confront. But before we wrap up, are there any resources you'd like our viewers to check out, or a social media presence they can follow?
Absolutely. Yes, I would definitely encourage people to check out our website, which is just sistersagainsttrafficking.org. We have so many good resources on there, lots of educational modules, ways to get involved and help support survivors, and then also those advocacy campaigns, legislation or like business targeted campaigns. So please do check us out, get involved. And we are on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. A number of the webinars we've offered in the past on different topics are on our YouTube channel. So check that out. And we would love to connect with you if you're interested in getting more involved in this issue.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
A huge thank you to Jennifer for that illuminating and helpful conversation. Thanks again to Sister Sally, and thank you for taking the time to explore these issues with me. If you found this interesting or if the themes resonated, I really encourage you to check out globalsistersreport.org. My colleagues and I are constantly reporting on trafficking, migration, and other social justice issues through the work of Catholic sisters. So globalsistersreport.org, I think you'll really enjoy it. And with that said, I'll just turn us back to Meg Nestor so she can walk you through some of GSR's resources.
Thank you, Soli, and thanks to Sister Sally and Jennifer as well. I wanted to wrap up this presentation with an introduction to GSR in the classroom, a curriculum project of Global Sisters Report. Each of the 8 lessons combine mission, scripture, and church teaching. Action ideas and compelling prayer bring new learning alive. Our teacher guides provide vital context and engaging activities to launch group discussions. We have 2 lesson plans that follow up on today's session, one on migration and one on human trafficking. This free resource can be accessed by going to globalsistersreport.org/classroom. Again, on behalf of Global Sisters Report, I want to thank you for being here today and for your concern about this critical topic. Together, we will make a difference.